It began with silence, a silence so heavy that 25,000 fans could feel it pressing against their chests. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was mid-song when it happened. His guitar kept strumming, almost mechanically, the way his fingers had done 1,000 times before. But his voice, the voice that had once shaken the world, suddenly stopped. Why? Because a single sound cut through the night. A voice. A voice that didn't belong to any backup singer, didn't belong to the band, and certainly didn't belong to the carefully planned show. It rose from the shadows, pure and untrained, carrying a haunting harmony to Love Me Tender, a harmony Elvis had never heard before. For a moment, nobody in the arena understood. Not the crowd, not the security guards who moved toward the stage, not even the musicians. Only Elvis seemed to understand. His eyes widened, his hands shot up to halt the guards, and he stood frozen, staring into the dark. And then he whispered a single word, a name. Diane. The audience couldn't comprehend the weight of that name, but those who truly knew Elvis understood instantly. It was a ghost from the king's past, a love story buried for 2 decades, a heartbreak so deep it shaped the very songs he sang. On August 16, 1976, 1 year to the day before Elvis would leave this world, that ghost stepped out of the shadows and into the spotlight. And what unfolded in Memphis that night would shock not only the audience, but Elvis himself, changing the final chapter of his life forever. This is not just another story about Elvis Presley. This is the story of the woman who stopped his concert, the voice that silenced the king, and the reunion that proved some love stories never die. It was August in Memphis, heavy with southern heat. The Mid-South Coliseum was buzzing, a powder keg of energy waiting for Elvis to light the fuse. Tickets had sold out instantly, 25,000 seats filled by fans desperate to see their hometown hero in what many suspected might be one of his last great shows. For all the fame and global stardom, Elvis was still Memphis's boy. The city loved him not as an untouchable legend, but as the son they'd watched grow from a shy truck driver at Sun Records to the man who shook the world with That's All Right. Every time he returned home to perform, it felt like family gathering around one of their own. That night, Elvis was in rare form. He stormed through his opening numbers like a man determined to prove he still had the fire. Burning Love, Hound Dog, Suspicious Minds, each one delivered with a ferocity that sent the crowd into waves of screams and tears. He moved across the stage with his old swagger, voice rich, eyes flashing with that same mischievous glint that had once terrified parents and electrified teenagers. But under the surface, there was a truth no stage lights could completely hide. By 1976, Elvis was a man carrying the weight of years, fame, and unshakable loneliness. The drugs, the constant touring, the failed marriage, they had all taken their toll. Friends whispered that he was searching for something he couldn't quite name. Still, when he stood in front of his people, none of that seemed to matter. The arena vibrated with devotion, as if 25,000 voices together could hold him up, keep him going, keep him shining just a little longer. The concert followed a familiar pattern. The powerhouse rock numbers up front, the banter with the crowd, the showmanship that only Elvis could deliver. But everyone in Memphis knew there was always a moment in an Elvis concert when the spectacle stripped away. The sequins and spotlights faded, and what remained was simply Elvis Aaron Presley, a boy with a guitar, baring his heart through song. That moment came midway through the show. The band quieted, the screams softened. Elvis walked to center stage carrying nothing but an acoustic guitar. No orchestra, no brass, just strings and silence. It was time for Love Me Tender. Fans leaned forward in their seats. This was the song that had launched him into Hollywood, the ballad that had followed him for 2 decades. But more than that, it was the song closest to his heart, the one that seemed to reveal the man behind the king. The first chords rang out, soft and deliberate. The Colosseum fell into reverent quiet, broken only by the occasional sob or whispered, "I love you, Elvis." His voice was low, tender, almost fragile as he began the opening verse. He sang not to the arena, not to the cameras, but to someone unseen, someone only he seemed to know. For 25,000 people, it was a moment of pure intimacy. Elvis Presley, the most famous man in the world, opening a vein in front of them, singing words that carried more truth than perhaps any other line he'd ever recorded. But then something changed. Out of the silence came another voice, at first faint, then stronger, a harmony unlike any heard in Elvis's concerts before. It wasn't polished like the Jordanaires. It wasn't rehearsed like the sweet inspirations. This voice was raw, untrained, but heartbreakingly beautiful. It wrapped itself around Elvis's melody like it had been waiting for decades to join him. Elvis's head snapped toward the sound. His eyes scanned the shadows off stage. His band exchanged confused glances, unsure whether to keep playing. The audience stirred. Was this part of the show a surprise guest, a mistake? But Elvis knew. He knew in the marrow of his bones who that voice belonged to. His fingers kept moving across the strings, muscle memory carrying him forward, but his voice caught in his throat. For the first time that night, the king of rock and roll was silenced. Security men started to move, their instincts telling them to protect their star. But Elvis, without breaking rhythm, raised his hand and stopped them cold. His gaze remained locked on the darkness beyond the lights. And then he spoke, barely a whisper but loud enough for the microphone to catch it. "Diane." One name, one word, but it carried the weight of 20 years of longing, regret, and unanswered questions. The crowd didn't understand, but those closest to Elvis, the ones who knew his past, his first heartbreak, they felt the shock like a thunderclap, because Diane Sullivan wasn't just anyone. She was Elvis's first love. The girl who had been there in the earliest days at Sun Records. The girl who had walked away in 1955, shattering young Elvis's dream of a normal life before fame consumed him. And now, out of nowhere, she was here, on his stage, her voice blending with his in a song that had haunted them both for decades. The audience leaned forward, breathless, as the silhouette of a woman began to emerge from the shadows. She wore a simple black dress, her steps calm, assured, as if she belonged beside him. The lights caught her face little by little, revealing dark hair streaked with silver, eyes filled with something both familiar and unplaceable. Elvis froze. His guitar still played, but his body seemed paralyzed. It was as if time had folded in on itself, 1954 colliding with 1976. The king of rock and roll stood face to face with the girl who had taught him how to sing about love. And in that instant, the concert was no longer just a show. It had become a reckoning. To understand why Elvis stopped cold at the sound of that voice, we need to step back. Because this wasn't just about a stranger wandering onto a stage. It was about a ghost from the very beginning of his story. Long before the fame, before Graceland, before the rhinestone jumpsuits and sold-out arenas, there was Diane Sullivan. In the summer of 1954, Elvis was just 19 years old. He was shy, polite, living with his parents in a small Memphis home. He drove trucks to make ends meet. His dreams were fragile things, a half-formed song scribbled on scraps of paper, whispered into the night when no one was listening. And through all of it, there was Diane. She wasn't a star, not a singer, not anyone the world would ever know. But she was the girl who sat with him on the porch after long shifts, the girl who believed his music mattered before anyone else did. When he nervously stepped into Sun Records for the first time, it was Diane who encouraged him. She told him his voice carried more than notes. It carried feeling. For a young Elvis, she was everything. His first girlfriend, his first real love, the one person who seemed to understand that music wasn't just something he did, it was who he was. But fate, as it so often does, intervened. In 1955, just as Elvis was beginning to catch fire, Diane left Memphis. She married another man, choosing stability over the chaos she knew was coming. Elvis was devastated. Friends said he was never the same. He poured his heartbreak into song, disguising his pain in melodies the whole world would soon sing. Listen closely to the ballads, the love songs, the broken pleas in Are You Lonesome Tonight or Can't Help Falling in Love. Again and again he returned to the same wound. That loss, that girl, that unanswered goodbye. Over the years he tried to find her. Little attempts, small questions whispered to people who might know. But Diane had vanished, leaving no trace. She became a mystery, a private ache in a life lived under floodlights. And yet she never really left him. She was there in every love song. Every time he leaned into a lyric that sounded too raw, too personal, it was Diane bleeding through. By 1976, Elvis was a man worn down by the demands of being the king. His body was tired. His spirit was restless. Friends said he was always searching for peace, for purpose, for something that fame and fortune could never give him. What no one knew was that what he'd been searching for had already been lost 20 years earlier. Until that night in Memphis, when the past finally walked back into the present. The Coliseum was hushed. Elvis had just whispered a name no one expected to hear: Diane. The woman moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step carried 2 decades of memory. Her black dress caught the glow of the stage lights, but her face remained shadowed until she reached the microphone. And when the lights revealed her fully, Elvis froze. His jaw tightened, his eyes locked, his entire body trembling just enough for the front rows to notice. To the audience, it looked as if Elvis Presley had seen a ghost. Security was still on edge, waiting for the signal to remove her. But Elvis's raised hand held them back. Something in his expression told everyone in the building this wasn't an intruder. This wasn't a mistake. This was something deeply personal. The mysterious woman didn't falter. She lifted her head, looked directly into Elvis's eyes, and kept singing Love Me Tender as though the past 21 years had been just a pause, a long silence waiting for this moment to break. Her voice wasn't perfect. It wavered slightly, but it had something more powerful than perfection: truth. It was raw, it was human, and it was steeped in memory. The harmony she wove around Elvis's melody was unlike anything the audience had heard before. It was as though the song itself had been waiting to be completed. And for 30 unbearable seconds, Elvis couldn't sing. His guitar filled the silence, but his voice, the voice that had commanded the world, was gone. He stared at her, lips parted, eyes wide, as though time itself had folded in half and delivered him back to the boy he once was. Finally, with a crack in his voice that betrayed the man behind the legend, he whispered again, "Diane, is that really you?" The crowd gasped. Whispers spread like wildfire. Who was she? What did her name mean? Why did Elvis look as though the ground beneath him had given way? And then, softly but clearly, the woman answered, "Hello, Elvis. I've been waiting 21 years to hear you sing that song in person." The words echoed through the Coliseum. 25,000 people, each realizing they were no longer watching a concert. They were watching a reunion, a secret chapter of Elvis Presley's heart playing out in front of them. Elvis set his guitar down and stepped closer, unable to take his eyes off her. For a moment, the world disappeared. It was just 2 people who had once been everything to each other, standing face to face after decades apart. The tension in the arena was unbearable. Fans leaned forward, desperate to understand, desperate to know who this woman was to their idol. Every second dripped with anticipation. And then Elvis turned to the microphone, his voice breaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet someone very special. This is Diane Sullivan. She taught me how to sing love songs." The audience erupted in applause, though confusion lingered. They didn't know the history, not fully, but they could feel it. The weight in Elvis's tone, the tears in his eyes, the way his hand trembled when he reached toward hers. Something sacred was happening. The woman took a deep breath, steadying herself. "There's something I should have told you 21 years ago," she said, her voice shaking but firm. The arena fell into silence again, thousands holding their breath. Elvis's face crumpled with emotion. He braced himself, as if he'd been waiting his whole life to hear what came next. "I didn't leave because I didn't love you," she continued. "I left because I loved you too much." A hush swept across the crowd. Elvis closed his eyes, tears spilling down his cheeks. This wasn't just a stranger on stage. This was the lost piece of his heart. And as the Colosseum sat suspended between disbelief and wonder, Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, took the hand of the woman who had just rewritten his story in front of 25,000 witnesses. The Colosseum sat in stunned silence. Elvis Presley had just introduced Diane Sullivan, a name most in the audience had never heard before. Yet from the way his voice cracked, the way his eyes shone with recognition, everyone understood. This woman mattered. But what did she mean to him? And why now, after more than 2 decades, was she here? Diane stood at the microphone, her dark hair catching the stage lights. She looked nothing like the screaming fans who crowded the front rows. She wasn't chasing autographs or begging for attention. She stood steady, her voice still trembling from the harmony she just shared with Elvis. "Elvis," she said, her words floating across the vast arena, "I've carried something for 21 years, and I can't hold it anymore." The crowd held its breath. Elvis stepped toward her, visibly shaking, his sequined jumpsuit glittering under the lights but his face stripped bare of performance. For once, this was the king. This was just Elvis, a man confronting the echo of his own past. Diane's words came slow, deliberate, heavy. "I didn't walk away because I didn't love you. I walked away because I loved you too much." A gasp rippled through the arena. Even those who didn't know the history understood the gravity. This wasn't a stage stunt. This was confession, raw and real. Elvis covered his mouth, eyes glistening. The man who had captivated millions with effortless charisma suddenly looked small, vulnerable, undone. He reached out and took Diane's hand. The audience roared, then fell silent again, waiting, desperate to know what would come next. "You were meant for the world," Diane continued. "I knew it back then, and I knew that if I stayed, I'd hold you back, so I made the hardest choice of my life." Her words cracked on the last sentence, tears spilling down her cheeks. Elvis shook his head, his voice breaking as he answered, "You didn't hold me back. Losing you, that's what I've been singing about for 20 years." The arena trembled with emotion. Fans clutched each other's hands, some weeping openly. They could feel the ground shifting beneath them. This was no longer a concert. This was history unfolding, heartbreak being exorcised in real time. And then Diane spoke again, her voice soft but clear. "Elvis, will you sing it with me? One more time, the way we used to in your mama's living room." Elvis froze. For a moment he seemed almost too overwhelmed to respond. Then he nodded slowly, picked up his guitar again, and strummed the opening chords. The crowd leaned forward. The tension was unbearable. Everyone knew they were about to witness something never rehearsed, never planned, a moment no ticket could have promised. The first notes of "Love Me Tender" drifted into the night once more. But this time, it wasn't just Elvis. Side by side, Elvis Presley and Diane Sullivan began to sing. Their voices, his seasoned by years of fame, hers raw with unspoken love, blended together like two halves of a melody finally reunited. The effect was electric. The Colosseum seemed to dissolve into pure sound and emotion. Thousands of people forgot to breathe. Grown men wept. Women clutched their hearts. Even the security guards, hardened and stoic, lowered their heads as tears welled in their eyes. Elvis closed his eyes as he sang, and for the first time in years, his face softened into something free of pain. He wasn't performing anymore. He was the king. He was just a man singing to the woman who had once owned his heart. The harmony filled the space between them, not just in sound, but in time. 2 decades of separation collapsed into a single, breathtaking chorus. It was as though the unfinished song of his youth had finally found its missing line. When the final note rang out, silence followed. A silence so absolute it felt like the entire arena was suspended in air. And then, as if a dam had burst, the crowd erupted. The applause was deafening, a tidal wave of cheers, screams, and sobs. But Elvis wasn't done. He set down his guitar, walked to Diane, and pulled her into his arms. The embrace was long, desperate, trembling. A reunion 21 years overdue, unfolding under the glare of stage lights and the eyes of thousands. And then something even more extraordinary happened. Diane lifted the microphone again, her voice shaking but steady enough for every corner of the Coliseum to hear. "There's something else," she said. "I always sat in the back, 12 concerts over the years. I always came, always left before the end. But tonight I couldn't stay in the shadows anymore." The crowd gasped again. She had been there, quietly watching him, silently keeping him in her life all along. Elvis wiped his face, unable to stop the tears. "Diane, you don't know what this means to me." His voice cracked, his hand clutching hers as though afraid she'd vanish again. The band, the backup singers, the entire stage crew, all of them stood frozen, stunned. They understood they were no longer part of a show. They were witnesses to a love story rekindling itself before their eyes. And then Elvis turned back to the audience, his voice breaking but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this woman right here, she was my first love. She taught me how to sing from my heart. Every song I've ever sung about heartbreak was about her." The arena exploded. Screams, sobs, cheers, a sound so overwhelming it shook the rafters of the Coliseum. Elvis looked back at Diane, eyes locked on hers. And in that moment, the man who had spent his life adored by millions revealed the truth, that for 21 years he had carried a single missing piece. And now it had stepped back into his life, onto his stage, into his arms. The turning point had arrived. Elvis Presley was no longer just performing for his fans. He was living in front of them, the most personal and powerful moment of his life. The king had stopped his concert. But in doing so, he gave the world something far greater than a show. He gave them a glimpse of the man behind the legend and the love story that had haunted him for decades. The roar of the crowd refused to die down. 25,000 voices echoed inside the Coliseum, cheering, crying, begging for more. They had just witnessed something impossible. Elvis Presley, silenced mid-song, reunited with the woman who had first captured his heart. And the night was far from over. The audience began chanting, first softly, then louder, "Sing another, sing another." Within seconds, the entire arena was calling out. Elvis looked at Diane, his chest heaving with emotion, his face flushed from tears. "What do you say?" he asked, his voice low but caught by the microphone. "Want to help me finish this show?" Diane smiled, and for the first time in decades, it was a smile free of regret. "I thought you'd never ask." The crowd erupted again as Elvis turned back to his band. He signaled with a nod, and the opening chords of "Can't Help Falling in Love" drifted into the air. But this time, it wasn't just a performance. It was a conversation. Every line Elvis sang, Diane answered in harmony. Every pause between verses was filled with glances, unspoken words, a dialogue built on years of separation and longing. Then came "It's Now or Never," and the title alone hit like prophecy. The audience felt it, Elvis felt it, Diane felt it. This was no longer about nostalgia or spectacle. It was about claiming the moment they had both lost. During "Are You Lonesome Tonight?", something even more extraordinary happened. Instead of delivering the lines in their usual scripted form, Elvis turned to Diane, his voice shaking with vulnerability, and asked her the questions directly. "Do you miss me tonight? Are you sorry we drifted apart?" And Diane, still holding her microphone, answered softly, "Yes, Elvis. Yes." The arena became a cathedral of emotion. Men who had come to see a rock show now wept openly. Women who had dreamed of Elvis since girlhood now watched him give his heart to someone else, and yet it didn't feel like loss. It felt like being invited into something sacred, a love so deep, so human, it belonged to everyone in the room. And then, the moment no one could have predicted. Elvis stopped the band. He turned back to Diane, eyes burning with intensity. Slowly, deliberately, he slipped a ring from his finger, a simple band fans had seen for years but never knew the story behind. "This was my grandmother's ring," Elvis said, his voice trembling. "I've carried it since 1955, waiting for the right time, waiting for the right person." He dropped to one knee. The crowd screamed, the sound deafening. Some thought it was part of the act, but Elvis's tears told the truth. "Diane Sullivan," he said, his voice cracking, "I have waited 21 years to ask you this. Will you marry me?" Diane's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming. She sobbed openly into the microphone. "Elvis Aaron Presley, I have waited 21 years for you to ask me. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." The Colosseum erupted into chaos, not of confusion, but of joy. Flowers rained from the stands. Strangers embraced each other. Thousands of voices shouted and cried as if they were witnesses to the most magical wedding on earth. And in a way they were. News of the night spread instantly. In Memphis, it was front-page headlines the next morning. Across the country, whispers turned into stories and stories into legend. The king of rock and roll had stopped his concert to reclaim his first love. Within 3 months, Elvis and Diane were quietly married at Graceland. It wasn't a spectacle. It didn't need to be. The real wedding had already happened that night on stage with 25,000 fans as witnesses. Friends said Elvis was transformed. For years they had watched him struggle, weighed down by fame and loneliness. But after Diane returned, he was lighter, softer, happier. He laughed more. He sang with renewed passion. He stopped searching because what he had been searching for had finally found its way back. The bootleg recording of that night became one of the most treasured possessions among fans. It wasn't just music. It was proof. Proof that behind the glitter and the legend, Elvis Presley was still a man who longed for love, who carried heartbreak, who could be undone by a single voice from his past. And though their time together was brief, only 10 months before Elvis's death in August of 1977, those who knew him best said they were the happiest of his life. Diane often reflected later, "Those 10 months made up for the 21 years we lost, and more." Today, the story still echoes. Fans whisper about it, families pass it down, and every so often, someone stumbles upon the bootleg recording and realizes they're hearing more than just a concert. They're hearing a love story that defied time, distance, and fame. Because sometimes, life gives us second chances. Sometimes, the people we thought were lost forever step back into our lives when we need them most. And sometimes, as Elvis and Diane proved on that unforgettable night in Memphis, real life is far more extraordinary than any legend. That night wasn't about sequins or sold-out crowds. It wasn't about the king of rock and roll. It was about Elvis Presley, a man with a heart that had never stopped beating for the girl who first believed in him. And when she finally stepped out of the shadows, he did what only Elvis could do. He stopped the music. He stopped the show. And he gave the world a glimpse of something greater than fame. He gave them a glimpse of true love. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more untold chapters from Elvis's life, moments that reveal the man behind the myth. And stay tuned, because our next story will take you to Baltimore, the night Elvis walked off stage mid-concert, leaving thousands in shock. Because with Elvis Presley, the truth is always stranger, more heartbreaking, and more unforgettable than the legend.